The day my family laughed at me
She
was
always
supposed to
does
be the
this.
day they finally took everything. I sat
She doesn't
silently
even know what
at my
she's
son's
signing.
dining room table while Ethan smirked. Lauren whispered jokes under her breath, and my own sister Patricia shook her head as if I were some foolish old woman who had ruined her life. They thought I was broke. They thought I was about to lose my home. They thought I had no one left to help me. Then the front door opened. A man in a dark suit stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase. The laughter stopped, because everyone in that room recognized him. He was the senior bank manager, and he had come looking for me. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to hear from you. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted, leave a comment below and share your story. And if this story speaks to you, please take a moment to like and subscribe. I always enjoy reading where everyone is watching from. So tell me your city, your state, and what time it is where you are right now. Sometimes knowing we're not alone makes all the difference. My name is Mackenzie Reynolds, and until a few years ago, I believed I had lived a life most people would call blessed. Not perfect, not wealthy, not extraordinary, but blessed. I spent more than 35 years teaching second grade in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. I wasn't the kind of teacher who won national awards or appeared in newspapers. I was simply the woman who tied untied shoelaces, comforted crying children, attended school plays, and watched generation after generation grow up. And for most of my adult life, I had David, my husband, my best friend, the man who made every ordinary day feel like enough. David and I met when we were both 23 years old. He worked at a local financial planning firm, and I had just started my first teaching job. We didn't fall in love dramatically. There was no movie-worthy moment. There was simply a quiet certainty, the kind that grows stronger with time. We married less than 2 years later. Together, we built our life from scratch. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house with creaky floors and an outdated kitchen. Every month, we worried about mortgage payments. Every year, we tried to save a little more. Like millions of American families, we lived carefully. We skipped expensive vacations. We drove used cars. We repaired things instead of replacing them. When friends upgraded houses, we stayed where we were. When neighbors bought luxury vehicles, we kept our old sedan. David always said something that used to make me laugh. "Rich isn't what you spend, Mackenzie. Rich is what you keep." At the time, I rolled my eyes. Now I understand exactly what he meant. Over 4 decades, we slowly built security. Not riches. Security. The kind that lets you sleep peacefully at night. When our son Ethan was born, David worked overtime. When our daughter Emily arrived 3 years later, I temporarily left teaching to stay home. Money was often tight, but somehow we always managed. And because we struggled together, I believed our children understood the value of sacrifice. I truly believed that. As Ethan and Emily grew older, David and I tried to give them opportunities we never had. We paid for part of their college tuition. We helped them when unexpected bills appeared. We attended every graduation, every sporting event, every important milestone. Even after they became adults, we remained available whenever they needed us. Maybe too available. Looking back now, that's one of the hardest truths to admit. When Ethan wanted help with a down payment on his first house, we provided it. When Emily faced medical expenses after complications during pregnancy, we wrote the check without hesitation. When childcare became expensive, I spent countless afternoons watching grandchildren. I never kept score, because that's what parents do. At least that's what I believed. Family helps family. David believed it too. For years, everything seemed normal. Our family gathered for Thanksgiving. We celebrated birthdays. We exchanged Christmas gifts. We posed for smiling photographs. From the outside, we looked like a family that had everything figured out. But sometimes, the cracks appear long before the wall collapses. You just don't recognize them at the time. The first signs were subtle, small enough to ignore. Ethan began asking questions about our finances. Nothing alarming at first, just casual curiosity. Have you guys paid off the house yet? How's retirement treating you financially? Did Dad leave good investments behind? Questions like that. Questions that sounded reasonable. Questions a loving son might ask, especially after David died. Because that's another part of this story. 5 years before everything fell apart, I lost my husband. Cancer. Fast. Cruel. Merciless. One day we were planning a weekend trip. Less than a year later, I was standing beside his grave. Nothing prepared me for that loneliness. Nothing. For more than 40 years, David had been my partner in every decision. Suddenly, every room in the house felt too quiet. Every meal felt incomplete. Every holiday felt wrong. During those early years after his death, I leaned heavily on my children, and they seemed supportive. At least initially. Ethan called more often. Emily visited more frequently. I was grateful. I thought they were stepping up because they loved me. I didn't realize something else might be motivating them. Lauren, Ethan's wife, started asking questions too. Unlike Ethan, she wasn't subtle. Lauren loved appearances. She loved status. She loved expensive things. Whenever she visited, conversations somehow drifted toward money. That house has probably doubled in value. You must have quite a bit saved after all those years. Retirement accounts are worth so much these days. I usually laughed and changed the subject. Money had never been something David and I discussed publicly, but Lauren always seemed fascinated by it. Then there was my younger sister, Patricia. Patricia had spent most of her life comparing herself to everyone around her, especially me. We loved each other in the complicated way sisters sometimes do, but jealousy had always existed beneath the surface. When she visited, she'd walk through my house and make comments. You always landed on your feet. You and David were lucky. I wish I had what you have. At first, those comments sounded harmless, but over time, they became sharper. Less admiration. More resentment. Still, I ignored the warning signs. Maybe because I wanted to believe the best about people. Maybe because I was lonely. Or maybe because after losing David, I desperately wanted my family to remain close. Whatever the reason, I kept dismissing things that should have worried me. I remember one Sunday dinner in particular. The entire family was gathered around my dining table. The grandchildren were playing in the living room. The adults were finishing dessert. Everything felt normal. Then Ethan casually asked a question. So, Mom, have you updated your will recently? The room grew strangely quiet. Lauren looked interested. Patricia immediately stopped talking. Even Emily glanced up. I laughed awkwardly. What an odd dinner conversation. Ethan smiled, but something about that smile felt rehearsed. Just trying to help you plan ahead. Everyone nodded, almost too quickly. At the time, I brushed it off. Now I see that moment differently. Now I understand it wasn't really about planning. It was about information, about access, about knowing exactly what stood between them and everything David and I had spent 40 years building. Back then, though, I remained blind. I still saw my children through a mother's eyes. I still believed love naturally protected families from greed. I still believed my sacrifices had created gratitude. And most importantly, I still believed the people sitting around my table wanted what was best for me. I had no idea that behind the smiles, the concern, and the family dinners, something much darker was already beginning to take shape. Something that would eventually leave me sitting in my son's dining room while my own family laughed at what they believed was my downfall. And by the time I finally recognized the danger, the first pieces of my life had already started slipping out of my hands. My name is Mackenzie Reynolds, and until a few years ago, I believed I had lived a life most people would call blessed. Not perfect, not wealthy, not extraordinary, but blessed. I spent more than 35 years teaching second grade in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. I wasn't the kind of teacher who won national awards or appeared in newspapers. I was simply the woman who tied untied shoelaces, comforted crying children, attended school plays, and watched generation after generation grow up. And for most of my adult life, I had David, my husband, my best friend, the man who made every ordinary day feel like enough. David and I met when we were both 23 years old. He worked at a local financial planning firm, and I had just started my first teaching job. We didn't fall in love dramatically. There was no movie-worthy moment. There was simply a quiet certainty, the kind that grows stronger with time. We married less than 2 years later. Together, we built our life from scratch. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house with creaky floors and an outdated kitchen. Every month, we worried about mortgage payments. Every year, we tried to save a little more. Like millions of American families, we lived carefully. We skipped expensive vacations. We drove used cars. We repaired things instead of replacing them. When friends upgraded houses, we stayed where we were. When neighbors bought luxury vehicles, we kept our old sedan. David always said something that used to make me laugh. Rich isn't what you spend, Mackenzie. Rich is what you keep. At the time, I rolled my eyes. Now I understand exactly what he meant. Over 4 decades, we slowly built security. Not riches, security. The kind that lets you sleep peacefully at night. When our son Ethan was born, David worked overtime. When our daughter Emily arrived 3 years later, I temporarily left teaching to stay home. Money was often tight, but somehow we always managed. And because we struggled together, I believed our children understood the value of sacrifice. I truly believed that. As Ethan and Emily grew older, David and I tried to give them opportunities we never had. We paid for part of their college tuition. We helped them when unexpected bills appeared. We attended every graduation, every sporting event, every important milestone. Even after they became adults, we remained available whenever they needed us. Maybe too available. Looking back now, that's one of the hardest truths to admit. When Ethan wanted help with a down payment on his first house, we provided it. When Emily faced medical expenses after complications during pregnancy, we wrote the check without hesitation. When childcare became expensive, I spent countless afternoons watching grandchildren. I never kept score, because that's what parents do. At least that's what I believed. Family helps family. David believed it too. For years, everything seemed normal. Our family gathered for Thanksgiving, we celebrated birthdays, we exchanged Christmas gifts, we posed for smiling photographs. From the outside, we looked like a family that had everything figured out. But sometimes, the cracks appear long before the wall collapses. You just don't recognize them at the time. The first signs were subtle, small enough to ignore. Ethan began asking questions about our finances. Nothing alarming at first, just casual curiosity. Have you guys paid off the house yet? How's retirement treating you financially? Did Dad leave good investments behind? Questions like that. Questions that sounded reasonable. Questions a loving son might ask, especially after David died. Because that's another part of this story. 5 years before everything fell apart, I lost my husband. Cancer. Fast. Cruel. Merciless. One day we were planning a weekend trip. Less than a year later, I was standing beside his grave. Nothing prepared me for that loneliness. Nothing. For more than 40 years, David had been my partner in every decision. Suddenly, every room in the house felt too quiet. Every meal felt incomplete. Every holiday felt wrong. During those early years after his death, I leaned heavily on my children, and they seemed supportive, at least initially. Ethan called more often. Emily visited more frequently. I was grateful. I thought they were stepping up because they loved me. I didn't realize something else might be motivating them. Lauren, Ethan's wife, started asking questions too. Unlike Ethan, she wasn't subtle. Lauren loved appearances. She loved status. She loved expensive things. Whenever she visited, conversations somehow drifted toward money. That house has probably doubled in value. You must have quite a bit saved after all those years. Retirement accounts are worth so much these days. I usually laughed and changed the subject. Money had never been something David and I discussed publicly, but Lauren always seemed fascinated by it. Then there was my younger sister, Patricia. Patricia had spent most of her life comparing herself to everyone around her, especially me. We loved each other in the complicated way sisters sometimes do, but jealousy had always existed beneath the surface. When she visited, she'd walk through my house and make comments. You always landed on your feet. You and David were lucky. I wish I had what you have. At first, those comments sounded harmless, but over time, they became sharper. Less admiration, more resentment. Still, I ignored the warning signs. Maybe because I wanted to believe the best about people. Maybe because I was lonely. Or maybe because after losing David, I desperately wanted my family to remain close. Whatever the reason, I kept dismissing things that should have worried me. I remember one Sunday dinner in particular. The entire family was gathered around my dining table. The grandchildren were playing in the living room. The adults were finishing dessert. Everything felt normal. Then Ethan casually asked a question. So, Mom, have you updated your will recently? The room grew strangely quiet. Lauren looked interested. Patricia immediately stopped talking. Even Emily glanced up. I laughed awkwardly. What an odd dinner conversation. Ethan smiled, but something about that smile felt rehearsed. Just trying to help you plan ahead. Everyone nodded, almost too quickly. At the time, I brushed it off. Now I see that moment differently. Now I understand it wasn't really about planning. It was about information, about access, about knowing exactly what stood between them and everything David and I had spent 40 years building. Back then, though, I remained blind. I still saw my children through a mother's eyes. I still believed love naturally protected families from greed. I still believed my sacrifices had created gratitude. And most importantly, I still believed the people sitting around my table wanted what was best for me. I had no idea that behind the smiles, the concern, and the family dinners, something much darker was already beginning to take shape. Something that would eventually leave me sitting in my son's dining room while my own family laughed at what they believed was my downfall. And by the time I finally recognized the danger, the first pieces of my life had already started slipping out of my hands. The folder looked harmless. That was the frightening part. If Ethan had arrived carrying something that appeared suspicious, I would have refused immediately. If he had demanded control over my finances, I would have shown him the door. If he had openly admitted what he wanted, I would have recognized the danger. Instead, he arrived with a warm smile, a stack of neatly organized documents, and a story designed to sound completely reasonable. Mom, this is just responsible planning. I can still hear those words. Responsible planning. The phrase would become the beginning of one of the biggest mistakes of my life. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I had invited Ethan over for lunch. The weather was miserable, and I was grateful for the company. We ate tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches at my kitchen table. For most of the meal, the conversation felt normal. We talked about the grandchildren, the local school district, the unusually cold weather. Then Ethan glanced toward the folder sitting beside his chair. I remember the exact moment. His expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough to signal he had been waiting for the right opportunity. Actually, Mom, there's something I wanted to discuss. I set down my spoon. What is it? He slid the folder toward me. Nothing complicated. That should have been my first warning. Whenever someone begins by saying something isn't complicated, it usually is. Ethan opened the folder and removed several documents. I've been talking to some people. What people? Financial advisors, estate planners, people who understand what families should do as parents get older. I frowned. I'm not that old. He laughed. I know, Mom, but the way he said it felt patronizing. The kind of laugh people use when they don't actually agree. Then he pointed at the papers. This is just precautionary stuff. The first document appeared to be related to financial assistance. The second involved account access. The third concerned emergency decision-making authority. Each page contained dense legal language, paragraph after paragraph. Small print, technical terminology, the kind of paperwork most people don't fully understand, including me. Why do I need this? I asked. Ethan sighed dramatically. Because if something ever happens to you, everything becomes harder. Nothing is happening to me. I know. Again, that same smile, that same reassuring tone, that same carefully controlled patience. Mom, this isn't about today. It's about the future. I should have stopped the conversation right there. Instead, I listened. Because he was my son. Because I trusted him. Because trust sometimes makes intelligent people ignore obvious risks. A few days later, Ethan returned. This time, he wasn't alone. Lauren came with him. The moment she walked through my front door, I knew they had discussed this beforehand. Everything felt coordinated, planned, prepared. Lauren sat beside me on the couch and immediately began talking about a friend whose elderly mother had been financially exploited. Then another story, then another. Each story ended with the same lesson. Families needed protection. Families needed preparation. Families needed legal authority. Eventually, Ethan pulled out the folder again. The same folder. The same documents, the same reassuring language. Only this time, there were two people persuading me instead of one. And they were good at it. Very good. By the end of the evening, I felt less confident than when they arrived. Not because they had proven anything, because they had slowly planted doubt. What if I missed something important? What if I became sick unexpectedly? What if there was an emergency? What if they were right? A week later, Emily joined the conversation. That hurt more than I expected. I had always viewed Emily as my softer child, more compassionate, more cautious. If Ethan pushed too hard, Emily usually balanced him out. But not this time. We met for coffee at a small cafe near her neighborhood. Halfway through our conversation, she brought up the documents. I stared at her. You too. Emily looked uncomfortable. I'm not saying Ethan is right about everything, but... She hesitated. But maybe some planning makes sense. That was the moment I felt trapped. Not because anyone forced me, because everyone seemed to agree. My son, my daughter-in-law, even Patricia. It felt as though I was the only person who disagreed. And when enough people repeat the same message, you begin questioning yourself. Especially when you're grieving. Especially when you're lonely. Especially when you desperately want your family to remain united. Over the following month, the pressure continued. Not aggressively, not openly, relentlessly. A comment here, a suggestion there, a reminder during dinner, a conversation after church. Always polite, always reasonable, always framed as concern. Until eventually I started believing resistance might be selfish. Maybe they really were trying to help. Maybe I was being stubborn. Maybe David would have agreed with them. That final thought pushed me over the edge. I missed my husband so much that sometimes I imagined what advice he might give, and in my loneliness, I convinced myself he would want family cooperation. So I agreed to review the documents. The signing happened in Ethan's dining room. Looking back, I find that detail significant. Why wasn't it done at my bank? Why wasn't it done in a lawyer's office? Why wasn't there an independent professional explaining everything? Because those questions never occurred to me. At the time, I saw a family gathering, nothing more. Lauren prepared coffee. Patricia sat nearby. Emily arrived later. The atmosphere felt strangely cheerful, almost celebratory. I remember thinking everyone seemed unusually happy. Ethan carefully organized the paperwork. He placed sticky notes where signatures were required. Then he began explaining each document, or at least what he claimed each document meant. This just helps if you're unavailable. Sign. This allows easier communication. Sign. This protects your interests. Sign. Every explanation sounded harmless, simple, practical. I trusted him, so I signed, page after page, line after line, without fully understanding the legal implications, without seeking independent advice, without calling my bank, without contacting an attorney, without reading every word, one signature at a time. I handed over far more authority than I realized. The terrifying truth is that nothing felt wrong in that moment. No alarms, no dramatic confrontation, no obvious deception. Just family, paperwork, coffee, smiles, and trust. After the final document was signed, Ethan collected everything. I noticed relief flash across his face, only briefly, but it was there. Then Lauren hugged me. Emily smiled. Patricia congratulated everyone for getting organized. The entire atmosphere felt strangely triumphant, as if something important had been accomplished. At the time, I assumed they were relieved because the planning process was finished. Now I understand something different. They weren't celebrating preparation. They were celebrating access, because from that day forward, a door had opened. A door that gave Ethan far more influence over my financial life than I ever intended. And the changes began almost immediately. Small changes at first, easy to overlook. A request for account information, a suggestion regarding investments, questions about monthly expenses, recommendations about bill payments. Everything appeared harmless. Everything seemed logical. Yet with every passing week, I felt myself losing a little more control, a little more independence, a little more confidence. The most dangerous part was that I still didn't understand what was happening. I still believed my family was protecting me. I still believed the documents were routine. I still believed I remained fully in charge. But somewhere inside that folder, hidden among all the legal language I never properly read, was the foundation for everything that would follow. And very soon, the consequences would become impossible to ignore. Because the next time I needed access to my own money, something happened that changed everything. Something that left me standing in complete shock. My debit card didn't work. And that was only the beginning. The first time my debit card was declined, I assumed it was a mistake. Everyone has experienced it at least once. A bank error, a damaged card, a technical problem, something temporary, something harmless. I was standing in line at a grocery store a few miles from my house. Nothing unusual, just milk, bread, coffee, and a few household supplies. The cashier scanned everything. I inserted my card. Then I waited. A few seconds later, the machine beeped. Declined. I frowned. That's strange. The cashier smiled politely. It happens sometimes. I tried again. Declined. The people behind me shifted impatiently. My face grew warm. Embarrassed, I pulled out another card and completed the purchase. As I walked to my car, I felt mildly annoyed. Nothing more. Certainly not alarmed. At that point, I still trusted Ethan completely. I assumed there had to be a reasonable explanation. When I arrived home, I called him. Hey, Ethan. Hi, Mom. My debit card was declined. There was a brief pause, then his voice remained calm. Oh, that. Something about those words immediately bothered me. Oh, that. As though he already knew, as though he had expected my call. What do you mean? We made a few security adjustments. My stomach tightened. Just protecting everything. I stared at the kitchen wall. What exactly does that mean? It means some safeguards were added. Without telling me? Another pause. Then came the familiar tone. Patient, calm, condescending. Mom, you're overreacting. I hated hearing those words, especially because people only say them when they want your concerns to disappear. I'd like to know what's happening with my accounts. You don't need to worry. Need. Another word I was beginning to dislike. I hung up, feeling unsettled. Not angry. Unsettled. The next few weeks became a series of confusing discoveries. Every time I tried accessing something, another obstacle appeared. First, it was the debit card. Then, it was online banking. One morning, I attempted to log into my account. My password didn't work. I tried again. Still nothing. I reset it. The system informed me certain account settings had already been modified. Modified. By whom? Why I called customer service. After answering several security questions, the representative explained that authorized account arrangements had been updated. The language confused me. I asked for clarification. The representative politely suggested I discuss the matter with my designated financial contact. Designated financial contact. I had no idea what she was talking about. Then she mentioned Ethan, my son. The realization hit me like ice water. Ethan had become involved in far more of my finances than I understood. For the first time, genuine fear crept into my thoughts. Not panic, fear. The kind that whispers rather than screams. The kind that asks questions you don't want answered. That evening, I drove to Ethan's house. I needed clarity. I needed someone to explain what was happening. Instead, I found Lauren sitting at the kitchen counter. She smiled when she saw me, but the smile felt different, less warm, more confident, almost triumphant. Ethan's running late. I nodded. I'll wait. The next 20 minutes were uncomfortable. Lauren talked constantly, yet somehow managed not to answer any of my questions. Finally, Ethan arrived. I immediately confronted him. I need to understand what's happening with my accounts. His expression changed, not guilty, not nervous, annoyed, as if my concern itself was inconvenient. Mom, we've discussed this. No, we haven't. Yes, we have. No? I looked directly at him. You never explained that I would lose access. His jaw tightened. You're not losing access. Then why can't I access my accounts? He sighed dramatically. the same sigh parents use with stubborn children, except now the roles seemed reversed. Because we're trying to protect you. Again, that word, protect. It appeared every time something didn't make sense, every time my independence shrank, every time my questions became uncomfortable. Protect. I began noticing another pattern. Whenever I challenged Ethan, someone immediately questioned my memory. Not directly, subtly, dangerously. Lauren would say things like, "Maybe you forgot the conversation." Patricia would add, "We definitely discussed that." Even Emily occasionally said, "I thought you understood." At first, I defended myself. Then something unexpected happened. I started questioning my own memory. That is one of the most frightening experiences a person can have. When everyone around you insists something happened differently than you remember. You begin wondering whether you're wrong, whether you're confused, whether you're imagining things. I was 67, not 97. Yet somehow, they were making me feel incapable. Every conversation left me more uncertain, more dependent, more hesitant to trust myself. One afternoon, a utility bill arrived. The amount was small, nothing unusual, but the payment had not been processed. I knew I had scheduled it. I always paid bills on time, always. Yet somehow, it had been missed. I called the company. The representative confirmed the payment arrangement had changed. Another change I hadn't requested. Another decision made somewhere without my understanding. When I confronted Ethan, he again insisted everything was under control. "Mom, mistakes happen." "But why are these mistakes only happening after I signed those documents?" His face hardened briefly, only briefly. Then the smile returned, the calm voice, the reassuring tone. "You've been under a lot of stress." That comment stayed with me long after the conversation ended, because it sounded less like concern and more like a strategy, a way to dismiss my questions, a way to make my doubts appear emotional rather than rational, a way to make me doubt myself. And unfortunately, it worked, at least for a while. I stopped arguing. I stopped asking as many questions. I convinced myself maybe I really was struggling. Maybe grief was affecting my judgment. Maybe Ethan knew what he was doing. Maybe I should trust him. Yet every day brought another small loss, another reminder that something had changed. I found myself asking permission for information that once belonged to me, waiting for updates about accounts that carried my name, receiving explanations that never fully explained anything. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the humiliation, the feeling that my life no longer belonged entirely to me, the feeling that I had become a passenger in decisions affecting my future. Then came the moment that truly frightened me, a meeting at my bank. I had gone there hoping someone could answer my questions directly. Instead, I encountered more confusion. Employees seemed cautious, careful, almost uncomfortable. One young banker reviewed my profile and suddenly became very quiet. She excused herself. A few minutes later, she returned with a polite smile. But something felt different, as though she wanted to say more, as though she couldn't, as though she had noticed something. When I asked about my account changes, her answers remained professional but vague. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Something wasn't right. Someone inside that bank seemed concerned. I just didn't know who or why. The following weeks became some of the loneliest of my life. Friends assumed everything was fine. Family insisted everything was fine. Yet deep inside, I felt myself slipping further away from control over my own affairs. And the more uncertain I became, the more confident Ethan appeared. That confidence terrified me. because it suggested he knew something I didn't. Then one evening he called and invited me to a family meeting. A meeting he described as important. A meeting he claimed was for my benefit. A meeting where everyone would gather to discuss my future. At the time, I thought things couldn't get much worse. I was wrong. They were about to get far worse. Because at that meeting, my family would finally reveal what they really wanted. And for the first time, I would see just how little my wishes mattered to them. The family meeting took place on a Sunday afternoon. Ethan called it a discussion. Lauren called it a plan. Patricia called it common sense. By the end of the day, I understood it for what it truly was. An ambush. I arrived at Ethan's house carrying a homemade apple pie. Old habits die hard. Even after everything that had happened, I still showed up like a mother attending a family gathering. I still wanted peace. I still wanted harmony. I still believed we could talk through our differences. The moment I stepped inside, I sensed something was wrong. Everyone was already there. Lauren, Emily, Jason, Patricia. Even Ethan's oldest son was helping arrange chairs in the living room. The setup felt unusually formal, not like a family visit, like a meeting, an intervention. I placed the pie on the kitchen counter. Nobody seemed particularly interested. That hurt more than I expected. For years, my family had loved my baking. Now it felt as though I had become secondary to whatever agenda had brought everyone together. Ethan eventually gathered us in the living room. I sat in an armchair near the window. Everyone else sat together on the couch. Looking back, the physical arrangement mirrored exactly what was happening emotionally. They were united. I was alone. Ethan cleared his throat. "Mom, we're all here because we love you." The moment he said those words, I felt uneasy. In my experience, people rarely begin difficult conversations that way unless they're preparing to say something painful. I folded my hands in my lap. "What is this about?" Lauren smiled sympathetically. That smile made my stomach tighten. "We've all been worried." Patricia nodded dramatically. "Very worried." I looked at Emily. She avoided eye contact. That frightened me more than anything. Emily always looked me in the eye. Always. If she couldn't do it now, something was wrong. Very wrong. Ethan leaned forward. "We think it's time to have an honest discussion about your future." Future. Another word I had begun to dread. Nobody seemed interested in my present. Only my future. Specifically, the future they had planned for me. I waited. Then Ethan finally said it. "We don't think it's safe for you to continue living alone." The room became silent. For a moment, I wondered whether I had misunderstood him. I stared at my son. "What?" He remained calm. Too calm. "We think it's becoming difficult for you." "Difficult?" Lauren jumped in. "The house is large." Patricia added her opinion immediately. "Far too large." Jason shifted uncomfortably. Emily remained silent. I felt my pulse quicken. "I've lived there for 38 years. Nobody responded. Instead, Ethan continued. "You've had financial issues." Financial issues. The phrase hit me like a slap. Financial issues that had mysteriously appeared only after I signed documents he brought me. Financial issues he continually claimed to be managing. Yet somehow, those problems were now being used as evidence against me. I opened my mouth to argue. Lauren spoke first. "We just want what's best for you." There it was again. That phrase. The one people use when they're making decisions for someone instead of with them. I looked around the room. No one seemed interested in asking what I wanted, only in telling me what they had decided. Ethan pulled out several sheets of paper. Not legal documents this time. Charts, property estimates, financial projections, house values. I stared in disbelief. They had prepared presentations, actual presentations, about my life, without me. "We've done some calculations," Ethan explained. The words sounded absurd. Calculations. As if I were a business transaction. As if my home were simply an asset. As if 40 years of memories could be reduced to numbers on a page. He pointed at one sheet. "Your house is worth more now than ever." Lauren smiled. It would be the perfect time to sell. Sell. There it was. Finally, the real objective. The room suddenly made sense. The meeting, the preparation, the charts, the concern, the pressure, the conversations, everything. It had always been about the house. I looked directly at Ethan. "I don't want to sell." His expression barely changed, almost as if he had expected resistance. "We understand that." No, they didn't. If they understood, the conversation would have ended there. Instead, it continued, because my wishes were apparently just another obstacle to overcome. Patricia spoke next. "Mackenzie, be realistic." I turned toward her. She crossed her arms. "You can't stay there forever." "Maybe not, but that wasn't the point. The point was that nobody seemed willing to let me decide when that day would come. They had already chosen it for me, without my permission, without my input, without my consent. Then, Lauren delivered the proposal that still makes my chest tighten when I remember it. "We've prepared a solution." A solution. I almost laughed. Instead, I waited. Lauren looked pleased with herself. "You can move in with us." At first, that sounded generous. Then she continued. "We converted the room behind the garage." I blinked. "The room behind the garage?" Ethan nodded. "It's private." Private. The room they were describing wasn't part of the house. It was a small converted storage area. I had seen it before. It was barely larger than a bedroom. No kitchen, no living room, no real privacy. Certainly not a home. "You want me to move into a storage room?" The silence that followed answered the question. Lauren hurried to soften it. "It isn't a storage room anymore." I looked at her, then at Ethan, then at Emily. Nobody seemed embarrassed. Nobody seemed shocked by the suggestion. Only me. Suddenly, I understood something devastating. This wasn't a temporary idea. They had discussed it extensively, probably for months. They had planned where I would live, what would happen to my house, how my finances would be managed, everything, without including me. I felt tears forming, not because of the room, because of what it represented. The loss of dignity, the loss of independence, the loss of control, the loss of respect. For decades, I had been the woman who cared for everyone, the woman who solved problems, the woman who hosted holidays, the woman who opened her home whenever family needed help. Now they were discussing me as if I were an inconvenience that needed relocating, a problem requiring management. Not a mother, not a grandmother, not a person, a problem. Emily finally spoke. Her voice was quiet. "Mom." I looked at her hopefully. Maybe she would stop this. Maybe she would defend me. Maybe she would remind everyone who I was. Instead, she said, "Maybe it wouldn't be so bad." The words broke something inside me. Not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. Because until that moment, a part of me still believed Emily was on my side. Now I wasn't sure anyone was. The conversation continued for nearly another hour. House sale estimates, living arrangements, financial management, future planning, decision after decision, recommendation after recommendation. And throughout the entire discussion, nobody asked the most important question. What do you want, Mackenzie? Not once. Not a single time. When the meeting finally ended, I drove home alone. The sun was setting. The house looked beautiful when I pulled into the driveway. The porch light glowed softly. The flower beds needed watering. Everything felt familiar, comforting, mine. I stood in the driveway longer than usual, just looking at it, thinking, remembering, and for the first time I realized something terrifying. My family wasn't trying to support me anymore. They were trying to replace my judgment with theirs, replace my choices with theirs, replace my life with the version they preferred. As I walked inside and locked the front door behind me, I made a silent promise. I would never willingly leave this house. Not because of the property value, not because of the money, because it was the last place where I still felt like myself. What I didn't realize was that while I was fighting to keep my home, my family had already started another campaign, one that would attack something even more precious than property: my reputation. And before long, people throughout our community would begin believing a story about me that wasn't true. The first person to look at me differently was a woman from church. Her name was Carol. I had known her for nearly 15 years. We attended the same Bible study group. We exchanged Christmas cards. We brought meals to sick neighbors together. Carol wasn't a close friend, but she was kind, or at least she had always seemed kind. One Wednesday morning, she approached me after a church service. Her expression carried something I couldn't immediately identify: pity. The moment I recognized it, my stomach tightened. She touched my arm gently. "Mackenzie, how are you holding up?" The question sounded ordinary, yet something felt wrong. I smiled politely. "Holding up with what?" Carol hesitated. Then came the awkward silence, the kind of silence that reveals more than words. Finally, she spoke. "I heard you've been having some financial difficulties." The room suddenly felt colder. "What?" Her eyes widened. "Oh." Immediately, I could tell she had said something she wasn't supposed to. "I didn't mean—" "No," I interrupted. "Tell me exactly what you heard." Carol looked uncomfortable, extremely uncomfortable. The way people look when they realize they've stepped into a situation they don't fully understand. She lowered her voice. "Someone said you lost a lot of money." I stared at her. Lost money. The phrase echoed in my mind. Who would say that? Why would they say that? And perhaps most importantly, who would believe it? I forced a smile and changed the subject. But the conversation haunted me for the rest of the day. By evening, I realized something far worse. Carol wasn't the only person acting strangely. Others had been behaving differently too. Small things, subtle things, things I had ignored. Now they suddenly made sense. People asking careful questions. People offering sympathy I never requested. People speaking to me as though I were fragile, as though something terrible had happened. The following week confirmed my fears. I stopped by a local coffee shop I visited regularly. The owner, a cheerful woman named Denise, greeted me warmly. Then she asked a question that made my heart sink. "Are things getting better?" I froze. "What things?" She looked confused. "The financial situation." There it was again. The same story, the same rumor, the same assumption. Someone was talking, and whoever it was had been very busy. I drove home feeling physically ill, not because of money, because of betrayal. Rumors don't spread by themselves. Someone had planted them. Someone wanted people to believe I was struggling. Someone wanted my reputation weakened. The answer became obvious a few days later. Patricia visited unexpectedly. My sister never arrived unexpectedly. She always called first. Always. Which meant she wanted something. We sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee. After a few minutes of meaningless conversation, she finally revealed her purpose. "You know, people are concerned about you." I nearly laughed. Concerned? Everyone seemed concerned these days. Concerned enough to discuss me. Never concerned enough to ask me anything directly. "What exactly are they concerned about?" Patricia shrugged. "You've had some financial setbacks." There it was, directly from her. Not implied, not suggested, stated. I stared at her. "What financial setbacks?" Her eyes flickered, just briefly. Then she recovered. "You know." "No, Patricia." I leaned forward. "I don't know." For a moment she looked genuinely nervous. Then she quickly shifted the conversation. The change was so obvious it almost made me angry. Almost. But something more powerful than anger was growing inside me. Awareness. For the first time, I began seeing the pattern clearly. The rumors weren't accidental. They were deliberate, calculated, designed. Someone wanted the community to believe I had become financially irresponsible. Someone wanted people to think I could no longer manage my affairs. Someone wanted to create a narrative, and that realization terrified me. Because narratives are powerful. Once enough people believe something, facts become secondary. Perception becomes reality. Over the following month, the situation worsened. Neighbors began treating me differently. Not cruelly, that would have been easier. Instead, they treated me with uncomfortable sympathy, the kind reserved for people experiencing tragedy. One neighbor offered to help me figure things out. Another suggested local senior services. Someone else recommended a financial counselor. I thanked them politely, then cried in my car afterward. Not because they were malicious, because they genuinely believed I needed help. And somehow, that hurt even more. One Sunday after church, I overheard two women talking. They didn't realize I was standing nearby. "Poor Mackenzie." "I know. At least her family is stepping in." The words hit me like a punch. Her family is stepping in. That was the story, the narrative, the image being created. A vulnerable elderly woman making poor decisions. A loving family rescuing her. The reality couldn't have been more different. Yet nobody knew that, because nobody had heard my side, only theirs. As the weeks passed, another troubling development emerged. Pressure regarding my house intensified. Ethan called more frequently. Lauren became more aggressive. Even Emily started mentioning practical solutions. Every conversation eventually returned to the same topic. Selling. Selling the house. Selling the property. Selling the memories. Selling the life David and I had built together. One evening, Ethan stopped by carrying real estate brochures. Actual brochures. I stared at them in disbelief. "What are these?" He sat down casually. "Just information." Information. Another favorite word. Everything was information. Everything was help. Everything was protection. Until suddenly, my entire life belonged to someone else's plan. He spread the brochures across my kitchen table. Several featured retirement communities. Others showed smaller homes, condominiums, senior living options. Places I had never asked to see. Places I had never expressed interest in. Places he clearly hoped would replace my home. "You should consider your options." I looked directly at him. "My option is staying here." His smile disappeared. Not entirely, just enough for me to glimpse something underneath. Frustration, maybe even irritation. The mask slipped for only a second. But I noticed. For years, Ethan had been patient. Now, patience was becoming difficult because I wasn't cooperating. I wasn't following the script. I wasn't surrendering the way he expected. The realization gave me an odd sense of strength. Small, fragile, but real. For the first time, I stopped feeling entirely helpless. Not because I had answers, because I finally recognized the game. Recognition changes everything. You may still be vulnerable, but at least you understand you're being targeted. Around that time, another disturbing discovery surfaced. A friend from church mentioned seeing Ethan speaking with a local realtor. Not unusual by itself. He was a real estate agent. But the timing bothered me, especially when I learned the conversation had involved my neighborhood, my street, properties near my house. I couldn't prove anything, yet my instincts screamed that something was happening behind the scenes. Something larger than rumors, larger than family meetings, larger than pressure. Preparation. They were preparing for something, and they seemed confident it would happen. That confidence frightened me more than anything else. Because confident people usually believe they already control the outcome. One rainy afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in my living room. The house felt unusually quiet. I looked around at the photographs lining the shelves. David smiling during family vacations. The children as teenagers. Graduations. Birthdays. Christmas mornings. Decades of memories. And suddenly, a painful thought entered my mind. What if none of this was really about helping me? What if it never had been? What if the rumors, the meetings, the paperwork, the pressure, the sympathy, the discussions about selling were all part of the same strategy? The possibility terrified me. Because if it was true, then the people orchestrating it weren't strangers. They were my family, the people I trusted most, the people I sacrificed for, the people I loved. That evening, I made a decision. I would stop relying solely on Ethan's explanations. I would stop accepting vague answers. I would find out exactly what was happening. The next morning, I drove to my bank. I wasn't expecting my life to change. I wasn't expecting answers. I certainly wasn't expecting an ally. But somewhere inside that building, a man named Robert Miller had already started noticing things that didn't add up. And very soon, he would become the first person willing to tell me the truth. The morning I walked into the bank, I wasn't expecting a miracle. I wasn't expecting justice. Honestly, I wasn't even expecting answers. I simply wanted anyone to explain why my own financial life felt like a locked room that no longer belonged to me. The branch sat in a quiet shopping center 15 minutes from my house. I had banked there for more than 20 years. The employees knew me. Some of them had known David. I remember sitting in my car for a moment before going inside. Part of me felt embarrassed. Part of me felt afraid. And part of me worried I might hear something I didn't want to hear. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe I really had misunderstood everything. Maybe the problem was me. That thought had become increasingly common over the past year. When enough people question your judgment, eventually you start questioning it too. I took a deep breath and walked inside. The lobby was quiet. A few customers stood in line. A young teller greeted me warmly. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds." I forced a smile. "Good morning." As she helped another customer, I looked around the room. Everything felt familiar, comforting, normal, and yet my life felt anything but normal. When the teller finally called me forward, I explained that I had questions about my accounts. At first, the conversation seemed routine. She reviewed my information, clicked through several screens. Then something changed. I watched her expression carefully. Her smile disappeared. Not completely, just enough for me to notice. She glanced at the monitor, then at me, then back at the monitor. A few seconds later, she said something unexpected. "Mrs. Reynolds, would you mind waiting a moment?" I frowned. "Is something wrong?" "No, ma'am." But she didn't sound convincing. She stood and disappeared into a nearby office. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, a man I had never met approached me. He looked to be in his late 50s, tall, professional, gray hair, calm eyes, the kind of person who immediately seemed trustworthy. He extended his hand. "Mrs. Reynolds." "Yes. My name is Robert Miller." I shook his hand. "I am the senior branch manager." Something in his voice felt reassuring. Not overly friendly, not artificial, just sincere. "Would you mind speaking with me privately?" My heart skipped. Private conversations with bank managers rarely lead to good news. Still, I followed him. He guided me into a quiet office and closed the door. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Robert sat down across from me. His expression was thoughtful, careful, almost cautious. "Mrs. Reynolds, how familiar are you with the changes that have occurred regarding your accounts over the last year?" The question immediately raised my anxiety. "Not very." He nodded slowly. "That's what I was afraid of." Afraid? The word sent a chill through me. "What do you mean?" Robert folded his hands. "I want to be very careful about what I say." His professionalism somehow made me trust him even more. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't speculation. This was someone trying to handle something serious responsibly. "I've noticed several transactions and account changes that concern me." My stomach tightened. "Concern you how?" Again, he chose his words carefully. "There have been numerous adjustments involving authorizations, account permissions, and financial access." I swallowed hard. Ethan said those changes were normal. Robert didn't immediately respond. Instead, he asked another question. "When you signed financial documents last year, were you represented by independent legal counsel?" "No." His expression darkened slightly. "Were the documents reviewed by your own attorney?" "No." "Did a bank representative explain them to you?" "No." The room suddenly felt smaller, much smaller. Robert leaned back. "I see." There was no judgment in his voice, only concern. Real concern. Not the kind my family constantly claimed to have. Actual concern. For the first time in months, someone was asking questions that mattered. Questions nobody else wanted answered. I felt tears forming unexpectedly. Robert noticed. His voice softened. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm not saying anything improper occurred." But the word hung silently between us. He didn't need to say it. I could hear it anyway. "I'm not saying anything improper occurred, but—" "What are you saying?" He paused, then chose his words carefully. "I'm saying there are enough irregularities that I believe they deserve closer review." Irregularities. The word echoed in my head. Not mistakes, not misunderstandings. Irregularities. Professional language. Serious language. The kind of language people use when something doesn't look right. For the next hour, Robert reviewed general account activity with me. Certain details couldn't be discussed immediately. Policies required additional procedures. Authorizations had to be verified. Internal records needed review. Yet even without specifics, I learned enough to leave shaken. Much of what I thought I understood wasn't accurate. Several permissions granted through the documents I signed appeared far broader than Ethan had described. Far broader. The phrase haunted me. I thought about the afternoon at his dining table. The coffee, the smiles, the reassurance, the sticky notes marking signature lines. Suddenly, every memory felt different, darker, more dangerous. As our meeting neared its end, Robert surprised me again. "Mrs. Reynolds, may I ask something personal?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Did your husband handle most of your long-term financial planning?" The question caught me off guard. "Yes." Robert looked thoughtful. "David Reynolds?" I blinked. "You knew David." A small smile appeared. "Not personally." He reached toward a file. "But I remember him." My heart began beating faster. Robert continued. "He was known for being extremely organized." That made me smile despite everything. "That's an understatement." Robert laughed softly. "I suspected as much." Then his expression became serious again. "People like David usually prepare carefully." I nodded. "They do." "Especially when protecting family." The room fell silent. Something about the way he said those words felt important, very important. Then he asked another question. "Do you know whether your husband maintained any assets outside your primary household accounts?" I frowned. "I don't think so." Robert didn't look convinced. Neither was I, because suddenly memories were surfacing. Small memories, forgotten memories. David meeting with attorneys, David organizing files, David making notes, David telling me not to worry because everything was taken care of. At the time, I never asked many questions. I trusted him completely, maybe too completely. Robert noticed my expression. "What are you thinking?" I looked down. "I'm not sure." "Take your time." For several moments, I sat quietly. Then I remembered something. A conversation from years earlier. A conversation I hadn't thought about in a very long time. David had once said, "If anything ever happens to me, there are protections in place." At the time, I assumed he meant insurance. Nothing more. Now I wasn't so certain. I repeated the memory aloud. Robert listened carefully. Then he nodded. "That sounds like David." The statement wasn't dramatic, yet it sparked something inside me. Hope. Tiny. Fragile. But unmistakable. Hope. For months, every discovery had made things worse. Every conversation had reduced my confidence. Every interaction had left me feeling weaker. This was different. For the first time, someone was suggesting there might be information I didn't know. Not information that hurt me. Information that could help me. As I prepared to leave, Robert stood and handed me his business card. "Mrs. Reynolds?" "Yes." "If you're willing, I'd like to continue reviewing some records." I stared at him. "Why?" His answer came immediately. "Because something doesn't feel right." Simple. Direct. Honest. The exact opposite of everything I'd been hearing from my family. I slipped the card into my purse. "Thank you." Robert nodded. "We'll talk again soon." As I walked back through the bank lobby, I felt strangely different. The problems hadn't disappeared. The rumors still existed. My family was still pressuring me. The account issues remained unresolved. Yet for the first time in many months, I didn't feel completely alone. Someone else saw what I saw. Someone else believed questions needed answers. And most importantly, someone else believed David Reynolds might have left behind more than memories. That evening, I sat in my living room thinking about my husband. About his careful habits, about his planning, about his quiet determination to protect the people he loved. And somewhere deep inside, a possibility began taking shape. What if David had anticipated something like this? What if the protections he mentioned years ago were real? What if everything my family believed about my finances was wrong? A few days later, Robert called, and what he told me next would change everything. Because my late husband had left behind a secret neither Ethan, Lauren, Patricia, nor anyone else knew existed. When Robert Miller called 3 days later, I almost didn't answer. I had spent the previous 72 hours replaying our meeting in my mind. Every question, every warning, every subtle concern. Most of all, I kept thinking about David, about the possibility that he had left something behind. Not money, not necessarily. Protection. The word lingered in my thoughts. Protection. The same word Ethan constantly used whenever he wanted control. But somehow, when I thought of David, the word meant something entirely different. It meant safety, preparation, love. When my phone rang that Thursday morning and Robert's name appeared on the screen, my pulse immediately quickened. Hello, Mrs. Reynolds. Yes. It's Robert Miller. His voice sounded calm as always, professional, measured. Yet beneath that professionalism, I sensed something else. Excitement, not dramatic excitement, the cautious excitement of someone who had discovered an important piece of a puzzle. I think we should meet. My grip tightened around the phone. Is something wrong? A brief pause. Then, actually, I believe something may be very right. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I wasn't sure I had heard him correctly. What does that mean? I'd rather explain in person. The suspense nearly drove me crazy, but Robert refused to discuss details over the phone. We scheduled a meeting that afternoon. The hours before that appointment felt endless. I tried reading, couldn't focus. Tried cleaning, couldn't concentrate. Tried watching television. Impossible. Every thought returned to the same question. What had Robert found? At 2 o'clock, I walked into the bank again. This time, Robert was waiting for me. The moment I saw his expression, I knew something significant had happened. He led me into the same office, closed the door, sat down, then opened a file, a thick file, far thicker than the one he'd shown me previously. My heart pounded. Mrs. Reynolds. He looked directly at me. I spent the last several days reviewing historical records. I nodded. Okay. What I'm about to tell you may come as a surprise. A surprise? That was an understatement. The next hour would change my entire understanding of the situation. Robert opened the file. Your husband was a very careful man. A small smile appeared despite my anxiety. That's true. He was also significantly more prepared than most people realize. The smile disappeared. I leaned forward. What did he do? Robert pulled out several documents, copies, official records, historical account information, things I had never seen before, at least not that I remembered. Then he said the words that left me speechless. David established a trust. I stared at him. A trust? Yes. I blinked repeatedly. My husband had handled most long-term financial planning. I understood the basic concept of trusts, but I had no memory of us having one. That doesn't make sense. Robert nodded. It does once you understand how it was structured. He slid a document across the desk. I looked at David's signature, my husband's familiar handwriting, my husband's name, my husband's decisions. Suddenly, he felt close again, painfully close. Several years before his death, Robert continued, David created a protective trust designed specifically to safeguard assets under certain circumstances. I looked up. What circumstances? Robert chose his words carefully. Circumstances involving exploitation, undue influence, financial manipulation, or improper asset transfers. I stopped breathing. Not literally, but close. The room seemed to disappear. The sounds outside vanished. Everything narrowed to one thought. David had anticipated this. Not specifically, not Ethan, not our family, but the possibility that someday someone might try to take advantage of me. My eyes filled with tears. Robert gave me a moment, then continued. The trust remains active. I stared at him. What? It remains active. My voice shook. I thought everything was gone. Robert's expression softened. No. The single word hit me harder than I expected. No. Not gone. Not destroyed. Not lost. No. For months, I had been living under a cloud of fear. Fear that my life was collapsing. Fear that I had failed. Fear that I had signed away everything. Now suddenly, the foundation of that fear was cracking. Robert continued. There is more. Of course there was. With David, there was always more. Always another folder. Another backup plan. Another safeguard. Another layer. I almost laughed through my tears. The man had been organizing our future long after his own death. What else? Robert opened another section of the file. There is a secondary reserve account. I frowned. A what? A separate account. My mind struggled to process the information. How separate? Robert answered immediately. Completely separate. The room became silent. I thought about Ethan, about Lauren, about all the account access, all the permissions, all the control. Then I asked the obvious question. Do they know about it? Robert shook his head. No. For the first time in over a year, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. Advantage. Not revenge, not victory. Advantage. The people trying to control my finances believed they understood my financial situation. Apparently, they didn't. Not even close. Robert wasn't finished. There is one more thing. I almost laughed. Of course there was. David was revealing himself one surprise at a time from beyond the grave. What now? Robert reached for another document. Then another. Finally, he looked directly at me. There is a safety deposit box. The words immediately triggered something. A memory. Faint. Old. Nearly forgotten. I closed my eyes. Suddenly, I could see David standing in our kitchen years earlier, holding a small envelope, smiling, telling me something important, but I couldn't quite reach the memory, like trying to grab smoke. A safety deposit box? Robert nodded. Registered under arrangements connected to the trust. I swallowed hard. What's inside? Robert smiled slightly. We don't know. The answer somehow made everything more exciting and more emotional, because whatever waited inside that box had been placed there intentionally by David, for a reason, perhaps years ago, perhaps specifically for a moment like this. I suddenly found myself crying. Not quietly, not gracefully, the kind of tears that arrive after months of pressure, months of fear, months of loneliness, months of believing I was losing everything. Robert patiently waited. Eventually, I managed to compose myself. I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize. I wiped my eyes, then looked down at the documents, at David's signature, at evidence of decisions he made long before his death, at proof that he had continued protecting me even after he was gone. The realization overwhelmed me. All these months I had felt abandoned, not by David, by circumstance, by family, by life. Now I understood something extraordinary. David had never stopped taking care of me. Not completely. He couldn't stop cancer. He couldn't stop death. But he had done everything possible to prepare for the day he wouldn't be here. And somehow that realization made me feel less alone. Robert eventually closed the file. "There is still work to do." I nodded. Of course there was. The battle wasn't over, not even close, but suddenly it felt winnable. For the first time since this nightmare began, I could see a path forward. A real one, not built on fear, not built on surrender, built on truth. As our meeting ended, Robert handed me another business card. This one belonged to an attorney, a man named Benjamin Harris. The name meant nothing to me, yet Robert seemed confident. "Who is he?" Robert smiled. "Someone your husband trusted." I stared at the card. Another piece of the puzzle. Another door opening. Another secret waiting. Then Robert said something that sent a chill down my spine. "I believe what you'll find in that safety deposit box may explain everything." Everything. The word echoed in my thoughts all the way home. Because somewhere inside that box were answers. Answers David wanted me to have. Answers Ethan hoped I would never discover. And very soon, I would finally learn exactly what my husband knew all along. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. For months, anxiety had been the first thing I felt each day. Fear, uncertainty, dread. But that morning was different. I felt anticipation. The safety deposit box sat in my mind, like a locked door waiting to be opened. Somewhere inside was something David had intentionally left behind, something important enough to protect, something important enough to hide, and if Robert was right, something important enough to change everything. I made coffee, but barely drank it. I attempted breakfast, but couldn't eat. By 9 o'clock, I was already dressed and sitting in my car. The appointment wasn't until 10. Patience had never been my strongest quality. Not when David was alive. Certainly not now. When I arrived at the bank, Robert was waiting near the entrance. His calm professionalism somehow reassured me. The past few weeks had taught me an important lesson. Trust should be earned. And strangely enough, I trusted Robert more than some members of my own family. After a brief greeting, he led me toward a secure section of the building. The atmosphere immediately felt different. Quiet, private, serious. A bank employee verified identification. Several forms were reviewed. Records were confirmed. Then finally, a narrow metal box was placed on a table inside a private room. For a moment, nobody spoke. I simply stared at it. The box looked ordinary, small, unremarkable, yet somehow it contained part of my husband's voice, part of his thoughts, part of his final preparations. My hands trembled slightly. Robert noticed. "You don't have to rush." I nodded, then carefully inserted the key. The lock clicked. A simple sound, yet it felt monumental, like opening a door between the past and the present. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside sat several neatly organized envelopes, a leather folder, a small stack of documents, and one item that immediately captured my attention. A handwritten letter. My breath caught. Even from across the table, I recognized David's handwriting instantly. After 43 years of marriage, I could identify it anywhere. My fingers shook as I picked up the envelope. Written across the front were 5 simple words. "For Mackenzie, if needed." Tears immediately filled my eyes. Robert quietly stepped toward the opposite side of the room, giving me privacy. For several moments, I simply stared at the envelope. Then I opened it. The paper inside had yellowed slightly with age. David must have written it years earlier. The sight of his handwriting nearly broke me. I had spent 5 years missing his voice. Now, suddenly, it felt as though he was speaking again. I began reading. My dearest Mackenzie, if you're reading this, then one of two things has happened. Either I worried for nothing, or someone has placed you in a position where you feel uncertain, pressured, or alone. My vision blurred. I stopped reading momentarily. Not because I couldn't continue, because he had already been right. Every word felt as though it had been written specifically for this moment. I took a deep breath and continued. You have always believed the best about people. That is one of the things I love most about you. It is also the reason I spent so much time preparing for possibilities you might never see coming. Tears rolled down my cheeks. That sentence captured our entire marriage. I trusted. David prepared. I believed. David verified. For decades, our differences had balanced each other perfectly. The letter continued. If everything is fine, then this letter will seem unnecessary. If things are not fine, then remember this. You are stronger than you realize, smarter than you believe, and far less vulnerable than others may assume. I lowered the letter, crying openly now. Not from sadness, not entirely, from love, because even after death, David was still protecting me, still encouraging me, still reminding me who I was. Eventually, I finished reading. The final paragraph left me completely overwhelmed. No matter what anyone tells you, this life belongs to you. Your decisions belong to you. Your dignity belongs to you. Never surrender them simply because someone insists they know better. The room became silent. I pressed the letter against my chest. For months, my family had treated me as though I were incapable, as though I needed supervision, as though I needed permission. David's words shattered that narrative. For the first time in a very long while, I remembered exactly who I had been before all this started. Not a problem, not a burden, not an obstacle. Mackenzie Reynolds, teacher, mother, homeowner, widow, survivor, and still fully capable of making my own decisions. When I finally looked up, Robert gently approached. Would you like some time? I wiped my eyes. No. My voice was stronger than I expected. I want to see everything. He nodded. Together, we began examining the remaining contents. The leather folder contained copies of legal documents, trust records, asset schedules, account information, protective provisions. Everything meticulously organized. Everything unmistakably prepared by David. The deeper we looked, the more extraordinary the picture became. David hadn't simply created a trust. He had built an entire safety net, layers of protection, contingency plans, verification requirements, independent oversight provisions, safeguards designed specifically to prevent manipulation. And suddenly, I understood something important. David hadn't expected betrayal. He had anticipated possibility. The possibility that age, grief, illness, or pressure could someday place me at risk. He wasn't protecting me from specific people. He was protecting me from circumstances. Unfortunately, those circumstances had arrived. Then we discovered another envelope. This one was labeled Attorney contact information. Inside sat a business card. Benjamin Harris, the same name Robert had mentioned. Attached was a handwritten note. If assistance is ever required, Benjamin understands everything. I stared at the card. Everything. The word carried enormous weight. If Benjamin understood everything, then perhaps he held answers neither Robert nor I possessed yet. We continued reviewing documents. Eventually, another revelation emerged, one that completely changed the situation. Several of the documents David had prepared specifically addressed undue influence. The legal language was complex, but the meaning was clear. Certain actions taken under pressure could potentially be challenged. Certain authorizations could potentially be reviewed. Certain transfers could potentially be questioned. I looked at Robert, my heart racing. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Robert remained careful, professional, measured. But his answer was unmistakable. "I'm saying there may be options available that you didn't previously realize existed." Options. For nearly a year, I had felt trapped. Suddenly, options existed. Possibilities existed. Hope existed. As the afternoon progressed, we organized copies of everything. The original documents returned safely to the box. The letter remained with me. I wasn't leaving that behind. Not after waiting 5 years to hear David's voice again. As we prepared to leave, Robert asked an important question. "Has your family scheduled any additional meetings?" I immediately thought of Ethan, of the pressure, of the endless conversations about selling my house. Then I remembered something, a text message from the previous evening. Ethan wanted another family gathering, a major one, soon. I looked at Robert. Yes. His expression became thoughtful. "Good." The answer surprised me. "Good." He nodded. "Sometimes people reveal the most when they believe they've already won." The words lingered in my mind, because Ethan certainly acted like someone who believed victory was inevitable. And maybe that confidence was about to become a mistake. As I drove home that evening, David's letter sat on the passenger seat beside me. The setting sun illuminated the envelope. For the first time in months, I wasn't driving home feeling defeated. I wasn't frightened. I wasn't confused. I wasn't doubting myself. I was remembering who I was. And somewhere ahead, a family gathering was approaching. A gathering Ethan believed would secure complete control. What he didn't know was that the game had changed. Because now I had evidence. I had protection. I had allies. And very soon, I was going to meet the one man who understood exactly how David had designed this entire safety net. A man named Benjamin Harris. 3 days after opening the safety deposit box, Ethan called. His timing was almost perfect. Or perhaps from his perspective, almost perfect. Because while he believed he was moving toward victory, I was quietly preparing for something very different. "Mackenzie," he said. Not mom, not mother. Mackenzie. I had noticed that change months ago. Whenever Ethan wanted something, I became Mackenzie. More transaction than family. More problem than parent. "We need to have another family meeting." I sat in my living room holding David's letter. The letter had become a source of strength over the past week. Whenever doubt surfaced, I reread portions of it. Whenever fear appeared, I remembered David's words. "This life belongs to you. Not Ethan, not Lauren, not Patricia. You." "When?" I asked calmly. "Saturday." His confidence was unmistakable. He sounded like a man nearing the end of a long project, like someone preparing to collect a reward. "What's the purpose of the meeting?" A brief pause. Then came the answer. We need to finalize some decisions. Finalize. The word told me everything. This wasn't a discussion. It was a conclusion, at least from Ethan's perspective. I agreed to attend, then ended the call. The moment I set down my phone, I called Robert Miller. An hour later, I met with both Robert and Benjamin Harris, the attorney David had trusted, the attorney who understood everything. Benjamin turned out to be exactly the type of man I expected David would choose. Thoughtful, methodical, calm. The sort of person who spoke only when necessary. But when he did speak, people listened. For nearly 2 hours, we reviewed documents. The trust, the asset protections, historical records, authorization changes, financial activity, everything. By the end of the meeting, Benjamin looked directly at me. Mrs. Reynolds. I nodded. You have significantly more protection than your family realizes. The statement gave me a strange feeling. Not happiness, relief. For months, I had been reacting, defending, surviving. Now, for the first time, I could stop playing defense. Benjamin continued. However, what happens next is entirely your choice. That mattered. The choice was mine, not Ethan's, not anyone else's. Mine. We discussed options, legal responses, protective actions, documentation, potential consequences. And then Benjamin said something that stayed with me. Sometimes the truth reveals itself most clearly when people believe they're unobserved. I immediately understood. The meeting, let them talk, let them reveal themselves, let them believe I remained powerless. For the next few days, I prepared quietly. I didn't argue with Ethan. I didn't challenge Lauren. I didn't correct rumors. I didn't reveal what I knew. Instead, I listened, observed, waited, and the more I listened, the more arrogant they became. Lauren called twice. Both conversations centered around making things easier. The phrase had become almost laughable. Every terrible thing they proposed somehow existed for my benefit. Every loss of independence was help. Every reduction of control was protection. Every sacrifice they demanded was necessary. The hypocrisy would have been amusing if it hadn't been so painful. Patricia became even worse. 2 days before the meeting, she stopped by unexpectedly. Again, she sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee and speaking with remarkable confidence. You know, she said, this whole thing will be much easier once the house is sold. I nearly laughed. The house hadn't even been listed, yet she spoke as though the sale were already complete. I smiled politely. You seem very certain. She shrugged. It's inevitable. I looked directly at her. No, it isn't. For a brief moment, something flashed across her face. Not concern, annoyance, because I wasn't following the script. The same reaction I'd begun seeing from Ethan, the same reaction I'd seen from Lauren. Resistance irritated them, and somehow that realization made me stronger. Saturday finally arrived, the day Ethan believed would secure everything, the day I knew would change everything. I spent the morning surprisingly calm. Not because I wasn't nervous. I was, but fear and certainty are very different emotions. For months, I had experienced fear without certainty. Now, I had both. Fear remained. Certainty had arrived. Around noon, I dressed carefully. Nothing extravagant, just dignified. A navy blue blouse, simple jewelry. The pearl earrings David gave me years earlier. I looked in the mirror before leaving. For the first time in a long while, I recognized the woman staring back. Not the frightened widow my family imagined. Not the confused elderly woman they described to others. Mackenzie Reynolds. Still standing, still thinking, still capable. The meeting began at Ethan's house around 2 o'clock. The moment I arrived, I sensed something different, an atmosphere of celebration. Not openly, subtly, but unmistakably. Lauren greeted me with excessive enthusiasm. Patricia looked almost cheerful. Even Ethan appeared relaxed, far more relaxed than usual. The confidence radiated from all of them. They believed the outcome was already determined. I quietly took my seat. The same living room, the same arrangement, the same chairs. Only this time, everything felt different. Because now, I knew things they didn't. One by one, family members gathered. Emily arrived looking nervous. Jason looked uncomfortable. Lauren appeared excited. Patricia looked impatient. Ethan looked victorious. The meeting started quickly. No small talk, no pleasantries, no pretending. They had moved beyond persuasion. Now they wanted compliance. Ethan placed a thick folder on the coffee table. My stomach tightened slightly. Not from fear, from anticipation. The folder looked remarkably similar to the one he had brought months earlier. Another collection of papers. Another attempt to control the future. Another moment built on the assumption that I wouldn't question anything. Ethan opened the folder. "We've reached a point where decisions need to be made." There was that word again. We. Not me. Not the homeowner. Not the person affected. We. Lauren nodded immediately. Patricia agreed. Emily remained silent. Ethan continued. "The house situation can't continue indefinitely." The house situation, as though my home were a crisis, as though my independence were a problem, as though my wishes were irrelevant. He began discussing real estate values, market conditions, timing, financial efficiency. Every argument sounded rehearsed, because it probably was. Lauren eventually interrupted. "We've already done so much research. Research, charts, calculations, plans, everything except asking me what I wanted." Then came the moment that revealed exactly who they were. Lauren smiled. A confident smile. A greedy smile. A smile that appeared before she realized how much she was exposing. "Honestly," she said, "once everything is settled, everyone can finally move forward. Everyone, not you. Everyone." The distinction mattered, because the benefits they discussed never seemed intended for me, always for everyone else. I looked around the room, and suddenly I saw everything clearly. Not just greed, entitlement. They genuinely believed they deserved access to what David and I had built. They genuinely believed my resistance was selfish. They genuinely believed they were the victims. The realization was staggering. For years, I had blamed myself, questioned myself, doubted myself. Now I finally understood. The problem had never been my judgment. The problem was their expectation. An expectation that everything I owned would eventually become theirs. Ethan slid several documents across the table. Property papers, authorization forms, sale preparations. And then he smiled, the smile of a man convinced victory was seconds away. "Mom," he said, "this is the final step." The final step. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because what Ethan didn't know was that the people he least wanted to see were already on their way. Robert Miller, Benjamin Harris. And within minutes, the entire story he had spent months constructing was about to collapse. For a few seconds after Ethan slid the documents toward me, nobody spoke. The silence felt strangely heavy, almost ceremonial. Like the final moments before a judge delivers a verdict. Ethan sat confidently across from me. Lauren leaned back with the relaxed posture of someone who believed the hard work was already finished. Patricia looked impatient. Emily appeared miserable. Jason stared at the floor, and I sat quietly, waiting. Ethan tapped the top page. Mom, if we can just get these finalized today, everything becomes much simpler. Simpler. There was that word again. Months of manipulation wrapped inside a pleasant-sounding word. I glanced down at the paperwork, property documents, authorization forms. Preparation for the sale of my home. The home David and I had spent nearly 4 decades building. The home my children grew up in. The home where every Christmas morning, every birthday celebration, every family milestone had taken place. And they were discussing it like inventory, like merchandise, like a transaction. Ethan picked up a pen and slid it toward me. All we need is your signature. I looked at the pen, then at him, then back at the pen. The room remained silent. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting, expecting, certain. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Then the front doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house. Lauren frowned. Patricia looked annoyed. Ethan glanced toward the hallway. Are you expecting someone? I shook my head. No. Technically, that wasn't true, but I wanted to hear him answer, because I already knew what was coming. The bell rang again. Lauren stood. I'll get it. She disappeared down the hallway. For several moments, the living room remained quiet. Then I heard voices. Muffled, unexpected, confused. A few seconds later, Lauren reappeared, and for the first time that afternoon, her confidence had vanished. Completely. She looked pale, almost shocked. Ethan. Her voice sounded strange. What? There are 2 men here. Ethan frowned. What men? Before Lauren could answer, they appeared. Robert Miller entered first, calm, professional, carrying a leather briefcase. Benjamin Harris followed, equally composed, equally confident. The effect on the room was immediate. It felt like someone had opened a window and changed the air pressure. Everything shifted. Instantly, Patricia sat upright. Emily looked confused. Jason looked relieved. Lauren looked nervous, and Ethan looked furious. The expression appeared so quickly he couldn't hide it. For a brief moment, the mask disappeared. Not concern, not confusion, anger, pure anger. Robert nodded politely. Good afternoon. Nobody responded. The silence was deafening. Benjamin calmly approached the coffee table. Mrs. Reynolds. I smiled. Thank you for coming. Ethan immediately stood. What is this? Benjamin turned toward him. A meeting. The answer sounded harmless, yet somehow it carried enormous weight. Ethan crossed his arms. This is a family matter. Benjamin's response came instantly. Actually, it appears to involve financial and legal matters as well. The room grew even quieter. I could almost hear Lauren's heartbeat. Patricia looked ready to leave. Emily seemed on the verge of tears. Robert remained completely calm. A man who had clearly handled difficult situations before. Ethan tried again. Why are they here? I answered before anyone else could. Because I invited them. The words landed like a bomb. Lauren stared at me. Patricia blinked repeatedly. Emily looked shocked. Jason slowly raised his head. And Ethan simply froze. For perhaps the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. Benjamin placed his briefcase on the table, then carefully removed several folders. Very organized folders, the kind David would have appreciated. The sight immediately reminded me of my husband. Preparation, documentation, facts. Not rumors, not assumptions, facts. Benjamin opened the first folder. Before any further discussion occurs, several issues need clarification. His voice remained calm, professional, controlled. The voice of a man who didn't need to raise it because truth was already on his side. Ethan laughed nervously, a forced laugh. "This is ridiculous." Benjamin ignored him. Instead, he turned toward me. "Mrs. Reynolds, are you still the primary beneficiary and controlling party of the Reynolds Protective Trust?" I nodded. "Yes." The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The difference mattered, because silence meant nobody expected the question. Nobody except me, and Robert, and Benjamin. Lauren looked confused. Patricia looked confused. Even Emily seemed confused. Only Ethan appeared alarmed, very alarmed. Benjamin continued. "For the record, has that trust been dissolved? No. Has control been transferred? No. Have trust assets been surrendered? No." Each answer landed harder than the previous one. I watched Ethan carefully. Sweat had begun forming near his forehead. A small detail, yet revealing, because suddenly the confident man who had controlled every conversation looked uncertain. Robert opened another folder. "Perhaps I should clarify." Now everyone looked at him. The bank manager's presence carried authority. People trusted bank managers. People listened to bank managers, especially when money was involved. Robert spoke carefully. "Recent reviews indicate that Mrs. Reynolds remains the controlling party of substantial protected assets." Substantial! The word hit Lauren first. Her eyes widened noticeably. Patricia leaned forward. "What assets?" Nobody answered immediately, and that silence was intentional, because anticipation can be more powerful than information. Finally, Benjamin spoke. "The majority of the assets David Reynolds specifically protected prior to his death." The reaction was extraordinary. Lauren's face turned white. Patricia looked stunned. Emily appeared confused. Jason looked fascinated. And Ethan looked terrified. Not worried, terrified. Because unlike everyone else, he immediately understood the implications. The story was wrong. The assumptions were wrong. The plan was wrong. Everything he believed he controlled was suddenly uncertain. Benjamin opened another file. "Additionally, questions have emerged regarding how certain financial authorizations were obtained." There it was. The second bomb, the larger bomb, the one Ethan feared most. His voice rose immediately. "Are you accusing me of something?" Benjamin remained calm. "No." The pause that followed felt enormous. "I'm saying questions exist. Questions. Professional people love questions because questions lead to investigations. Investigations lead to facts. And facts are dangerous when someone has been hiding behind assumptions." Robert began outlining several concerns. Account modifications, authorization changes, permission structures, review requirements, historical inconsistencies. The language remained technical, professional, measured. Yet the meaning was unmistakable. Something didn't look right. For months, Ethan had controlled the narrative. Now someone else controlled the conversation. And he hated it. Absolutely hated it. I watched him carefully. The anger, the frustration, the panic. Everything surfaced simultaneously. For the first time, I wasn't looking at my son. I was looking at a man whose plan was collapsing. And the difference mattered. Because once I saw him clearly, I could never unsee him. Lauren finally spoke. "Wait." Her voice trembled. "Are you saying Mackenzie isn't broke?" Nobody answered immediately. Then Robert looked directly at her. "No." One word. One devastating word. No. The room froze. Every rumor, every assumption, every story, every conversation, every piece of gossip, destroyed by a single word. No, I wasn't broke. I hadn't lost everything. I wasn't dependent. I wasn't powerless. And suddenly, the entire foundation of their behavior began cracking beneath them. I looked around the room. Months earlier, these people had made me doubt my memory, my judgment, my independence, my value. Now, they looked like people realizing they had badly miscalculated. And the most remarkable part, the meeting wasn't even over, because Benjamin had only begun revealing the truth. The documents sitting inside his briefcase contained far more than anyone in that room expected, especially Ethan. And before the afternoon ended, every secret he had spent months hiding would finally come into the open. The silence after Robert's statement felt endless. No one moved. No one spoke. The room seemed frozen in place. Lauren stared at Robert as though she hadn't heard him correctly. Patricia's mouth hung slightly open. Emily looked between me and Ethan, completely bewildered. And Ethan? Ethan looked like a man watching a building collapse around him. Slowly, painfully, brick by brick, Robert remained calm, professional, patient, the way people remain calm when they know facts are on their side. Benjamin adjusted several documents on the coffee table. Then he looked directly at Ethan. Before we continue, I think it's important that everyone understands the situation accurately. Ethan immediately interrupted. This is absurd. His voice had changed. Gone was the confident son who spent months telling everyone what should happen. Gone was the calm family leader. Now there was irritation, frustration, fear. Benjamin ignored the interruption. Mrs. Reynolds remains fully capable of making her own financial decisions. The words landed heavily, because that had been the central lie. Not that I was poor, not that I had lost everything. The bigger lie was that I was incapable, that I needed supervision, that someone else should decide my future. For months, that narrative had quietly spread through our family and community. Now it was being dismantled, piece by piece. Emily finally spoke. What exactly is happening? Benjamin turned toward her. His tone softened. I believe some assumptions have been made regarding your mother's financial condition. Assumptions? A polite word, a very polite word. The reality was harsher. People hadn't made assumptions. They had built plans, entire plans, based upon those assumptions, and now those plans were collapsing. Patricia suddenly leaned forward. What assets are we talking about? The question came too quickly, too eagerly. Benjamin noticed. So did I. For years I had overlooked moments like that. Now I saw them clearly. The interest wasn't concern. It was curiosity about money. Nothing more. Benjamin calmly folded his hands. Mrs. Reynolds' private financial details are not the subject of today's meeting. Patricia immediately sat back, disappointed. The reaction told me everything. Everything. Months earlier, that realization would have devastated me. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. Ethan stood, pacing slightly, trying to regain control. People who depend on control rarely handle uncertainty well. What exactly are you implying? Benjamin finally looked directly at him, for the first time. I don't believe I'm implying anything. His pause felt deliberate. I'm stating that several financial actions deserve closer examination. The room grew quiet again, and then something remarkable happened. Jason spoke. For months, Jason had barely participated in these conversations, usually silent, usually uncomfortable. Now he finally raised his head. What kind of actions? Nobody expected the question, especially Ethan. I watched my son's face carefully. His expression tightened. Jason continued. Honestly, I've been confused for months. Lauren looked alarmed. Jason, no. He interrupted her. His voice sounded stronger than I had heard in a long time. I think we deserve answers. The word we surprised everyone, because suddenly the united front wasn't quite so united. A crack had appeared, a small crack. But real. Jason turned toward Ethan. You kept saying Mom lost everything. The room became still, painfully still. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Finally, someone had said it out loud. The rumor, the narrative, the lie. Ethan looked furious. I never said that. The denial came too quickly, too defensively, and unfortunately for him, several people remembered differently. Lauren avoided eye contact. Patricia looked uncomfortable. Emily frowned. Then Emily quietly spoke. You kind of did. The room exploded emotionally without anyone raising their voice. Because Emily had always supported Ethan, at least partially. If even she couldn't defend him now, the situation was changing, rapidly. Ethan looked at her in disbelief. What? Emily swallowed. You said Mom's finances were in trouble. Because they were. Robert finally spoke. No. One word. Again. No. The word seemed to hit Ethan harder every time. Because facts are difficult to argue with, especially when they come from a bank manager. Benjamin opened another folder, then carefully removed several documents. The records indicate a very different picture. I watched Ethan's confidence disappear in real time, minute by minute, sentence by sentence. For months, he had controlled information. Now, information controlled him. The difference was extraordinary. Lauren suddenly looked terrified. Not guilty, terrified. And for the first time, I realized something important. Lauren may not have known everything. She knew enough. But perhaps not everything. The possibility changed how I viewed her. Not innocent, not exactly, but maybe not the architect either. My attention returned to Ethan. He had stopped pacing, stopped arguing, stopped interrupting, because every attempt to regain control seemed to make things worse. Then Benjamin revealed the next piece. The trust established by David Reynolds contains specific protections regarding undue influence. The phrase immediately caught everyone's attention. Undue influence, legal language, serious language, dangerous language. Emily frowned. What does that mean? Benjamin answered calmly. It means David anticipated the possibility that someone might pressure Mrs. Reynolds into making decisions against her wishes. The room went silent again, because suddenly David wasn't merely a deceased husband. He was present, not physically, but through preparation, through foresight, through protection. Even 5 years after his death, he was still influencing the room, still protecting me, still shaping outcomes. Tears briefly filled my eyes. I missed him terribly. But in that moment, I also felt incredibly proud of him. Proud of the man who refused to leave me defenseless. Patricia shifted nervously. The confidence she displayed earlier had completely vanished. Nobody pressured Mackenzie. Benjamin calmly looked at her. That's a conclusion best reached after reviewing all relevant facts. The answer was devastatingly polite and devastatingly effective, because it wasn't an accusation. It was worse. It was an invitation to investigate. Ethan suddenly slammed a hand onto the table. Not hard, but hard enough. The sound startled everyone. "I'm done with this." There it was, the emotional reaction of someone losing control, not someone being falsely accused. Someone losing control. He pointed toward Benjamin. "You come into my house and start questioning everything." Benjamin remained perfectly calm. "Actually, Ethan, most of the questions existed long before I arrived." The response landed like a hammer. Jason looked away. Lauren stared at the floor. Emily looked heartbroken, and for the first time all afternoon, I felt sadness instead of anger. Because despite everything, Ethan was still my son. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle, helping him with homework, watching him graduate, holding him when he was sick. The little boy I loved still existed somewhere inside the man standing before me. That realization hurt more than any financial issue ever could. Benjamin eventually closed one folder, then opened another, the final folder, the largest folder, and judging by Robert's expression, the most important one. My pulse quickened. I could feel the atmosphere changing again. The room sensed it too. Everyone became quieter, more attentive. Even Ethan seemed nervous. Benjamin looked directly at me, then at everyone else. "The next matter concerns documented communications and account activities reviewed over the past several months." Documented. The word carried enormous weight. Because documentation doesn't care about opinions. Documentation doesn't care about narratives. Documentation doesn't care about family loyalty. Documentation simply records facts. And judging by Benjamin's expression, those facts were about to change everything. I looked toward Ethan. For the first time since the meeting began, he appeared genuinely frightened. Not frustrated, not annoyed, frightened. Because somewhere inside Benjamin's folder was information he never expected anyone to uncover. Information that connected the rumors, the pressure, the financial changes, and the relentless campaign to convince everyone I had lost everything. And within minutes, the entire family would finally learn who started it. No one spoke for several seconds after Benjamin mentioned the documented communications. The room felt suffocating. Every person sitting there seemed to understand that whatever came next would matter. A lot. Benjamin slowly opened the folder. Unlike Ethan, he wasn't dramatic. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He simply worked through facts. And facts, I've learned, are often more powerful than anger. Robert sat quietly beside him. The bank manager hadn't come to argue. He had come to verify. That distinction mattered. Very much. Benjamin removed several pages and placed them neatly on the table. Then he looked directly at Ethan. "Over the past several months, a number of communications were reviewed." Ethan immediately crossed his arms. The defensive posture told me everything. For the first time all afternoon, he wasn't trying to control the conversation. He was bracing for impact. Benjamin continued. "The communications consistently describe Mrs. Reynolds as financially unstable." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The words hung in the air. Then he added, "Despite evidence indicating otherwise." Lauren looked toward Ethan, quickly, instinctively. That glance revealed more than she realized. Because people look toward the person holding answers, and she was looking at Ethan. Emily's face slowly changed. Confusion was turning into understanding. Painful understanding. The worst kind. The kind that arrives when you realize someone you trusted hasn't been honest. Benjamin calmly turned another page. Multiple conversations included references to imminent financial collapse. My heart hurt hearing those words, not because they surprised me, because they confirmed everything. All the pity, all the whispers, all the rumors, all the strange looks. Someone had built that story intentionally, and now everyone in the room knew it. Emily finally looked at her brother. Ethan. His name sounded different, no longer trusting, no longer supportive, questioning. Ethan refused to meet her eyes. That alone told her enough. Benjamin continued. Several individuals appear to have been informed that Mrs. Reynolds could no longer manage her finances independently. Again, silence. Then Jason spoke, very quietly. But that wasn't true. Robert answered. No. Simple, clear, final. The room became still again. Months of manipulation were being reduced to a single, undeniable reality. It wasn't true. Patricia suddenly shifted forward, trying desperately to regain footing. Maybe people were just worried. Benjamin nodded politely. Perhaps. The pause that followed was deliberate. However, concern and misinformation are not the same thing. Patricia immediately fell silent, because there was nothing to argue with. Nothing. Facts are difficult opponents, especially when they've been documented. I watched Ethan carefully. Months earlier, seeing him exposed like this would have filled me with satisfaction. Instead, I felt sadness, a deep sadness, because no mother dreams of seeing her child sitting in a room surrounded by consequences. No mother imagines this ending. Not when she rocks him to sleep. Not when she cheers at Little League games. Not when she watches him graduate. And yet, here we were. The reality was unavoidable. Ethan had made choices, and those choices had brought us here. Benjamin eventually closed the folder, then looked directly at me. Mrs. Reynolds, based upon our review, several protective measures are available immediately. The statement shifted the conversation. For months, everyone had discussed what should happen to me. Now the conversation focused on what I wanted. The difference felt extraordinary. I nodded. Such as... Benjamin opened another file. Access permissions can be revoked. I felt my shoulders relax. Immediately, the thought alone felt liberating. No more wondering who controlled what. No more uncertainty. No more waiting for information about my own accounts. Benjamin continued. Estate planning documents can be updated. I nodded again. Absolutely, without hesitation. The existing arrangements no longer reflected reality, not after everything that had happened. Property protections can be strengthened. Another easy decision. The house would remain mine, not because I was stubborn, because it was my choice. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. Then Benjamin added something unexpected. You also have the option of taking no punitive action. The room looked surprised, especially Ethan. He seemed to expect punishment, retaliation, revenge. I understood why. Many people would have chosen it. And honestly, part of me wanted to. The hurt ran deep, deeper than anyone could see. But revenge wasn't what I wanted. Not really. What I wanted was freedom. Freedom from fear. Freedom from manipulation. Freedom from constantly defending my own judgment. Benjamin looked at me patiently. The decision is entirely yours. Again, your decision, your choice, your life. David's words echoed in my mind. Never surrender them simply because someone insists they know better. For months, I had forgotten that. Now I remembered, completely. I slowly stood. Everyone looked at me, even Ethan. Especially Ethan. For a long moment, I simply looked around the room. at my family, at the people who had hurt me, at the people I still loved despite everything. Then I finally spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, calmly, honestly. I spent most of my life trying to help all of you. Nobody interrupted. I helped with college. Silence. I helped with homes. More silence. I helped with children. Emily lowered her eyes. I helped whenever I could. The room remained still. Then my voice became stronger. But somewhere along the way, many of you stopped seeing me as a person. Tears appeared in Emily's eyes. Lauren looked away. Patricia stared at the floor. And Ethan? Ethan finally looked ashamed. For the first time, truly ashamed. I continued. You saw assets. Nobody argued because nobody could. You saw property. Silence. You saw money. Silence. You saw decisions that belonged to me and treated them as decisions that belonged to you. Emily began crying quietly. Jason wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Even then, I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger requires energy. And I was tired. Very tired. Instead, I felt clarity, the kind that arrives after a long storm finally passes. I looked directly at Ethan. I love you. His eyes widened because he expected condemnation, not love. But love does not require surrender. The words hit him hard. I could see it. Love does not require surrender. For years, I had confused those things. Many parents do. We give, and give, and give, until eventually we forget that love without boundaries becomes permission. Permission for others to take more than they should. That would never happen again. Benjamin eventually prepared several documents. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical, just practical changes, necessary changes, healthy changes, access permissions removed, protections strengthened, authority clarified, boundaries established. One signature at a time. This time, I read every page, every word, every sentence. And when I signed, I understood exactly what I was signing. The difference felt empowering. When everything was finished, Robert quietly gathered his materials. Benjamin organized his folders. The meeting was ending. Finally. Before leaving, Robert approached me. You did well today. I smiled. No. I glanced toward David's letter inside my purse. My husband did. Robert smiled knowingly. I think he'd be proud. The words nearly brought tears to my eyes, because I hoped they were true. More than anything. As everyone slowly prepared to leave, Ethan approached me, for the first time all day. For the first time without confidence, without arrogance, without control. Just my son, standing there, looking older somehow, smaller. Mom. His voice broke slightly. I waited. Several seconds passed. Then he whispered, I'm sorry. The apology was real. I could tell. But real apologies don't erase damage. They only acknowledge it. And sometimes, that's the first step, not the last. The first. I nodded slowly. I know. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it wasn't rejection either. Healing takes time. Trust takes longer. And both would have to be earned. As I walked toward the front door, I realized something extraordinary. Months earlier, I had entered this nightmare feeling powerless. Now, I was leaving it with something far more valuable than money: my life back. And over the next year, I would learn that the greatest victory wasn't protecting my assets. It was rediscovering myself. A year later, I was sitting on the same front porch my family once tried to convince me to leave. The evening sun painted the sky with shades of gold and orange. A gentle breeze moved through the flower beds David and I had planted decades earlier. And for the first time in a very long time, my life felt peaceful. Not perfect. Peaceful. There is a difference. Perfect lives don't exist. Peace, however, can exist even after heartbreak, even after betrayal, even after disappointment. Sometimes, especially after those things, I wrapped my hands around a cup of tea and looked out across the yard. The roses were blooming. The porch had recently been repainted. The old oak tree still stood proudly near the driveway. Everything looked familiar, yet somehow everything felt different. Because I was different. The woman sitting there wasn't the same frightened widow who walked into Robert Miller's bank a year earlier. That woman had spent months doubting herself, questioning herself, apologizing for existing. The woman sitting on the porch now knew something important. Growing older does not mean surrendering your voice. And learning that lesson changed everything. The months following the family meeting had not been easy. Healing never is. Television shows often portray dramatic confrontations as endings. Real life doesn't work that way. Truth creates consequences. Consequences create distance, and distance creates choices. Each member of my family had been forced to make those choices. Some made better ones than others. Patricia was the easiest, perhaps because she had always followed the strongest voice in the room. Once Ethan's influence disappeared, her confidence disappeared with it. She called several weeks after the meeting. The apology was awkward, uncomfortable, incomplete, but sincere enough. For the first time in years, she admitted something. She had allowed assumptions about money to affect how she treated me. Hearing her acknowledge it mattered, not because it erased the hurt, because honesty is the beginning of repair. Today, our relationship isn't perfect, but it is healthier. And healthier is often more important than perfect. Lauren took longer, much longer. For months, she avoided me almost entirely. Part of that came from embarrassment, part came from guilt, and part came from realizing that many of the plans she enthusiastically supported had never truly been hers to make. Eventually, she asked to meet, just the two of us. I agreed. We sat in a small cafe and talked for nearly 3 hours. For the first time, I saw vulnerability instead of confidence, fear instead of certainty. Lauren admitted something difficult. She had become so focused on what she believed the future should look like that she stopped listening to the person actually living it. Me. That conversation changed things, not overnight. Trust doesn't return overnight, but understanding began returning, and understanding matters. Jason surprised me most. After the meeting, he called several times simply to check on me. No agenda, no discussions about property, no conversations about finances, just genuine concern, real concern, the kind family members should show one another. Over time, our relationship became stronger than it had been in years. Sometimes, adversity reveals character. Jason's character turned out to be better than I realized. Emily carried the deepest guilt, Not because she had done the worst things, because she understood how close she came to losing herself. One afternoon, she visited the house alone. We sat at the kitchen table. The same kitchen where she once did homework as a little girl. The same kitchen where David taught her how to make pancakes. The same kitchen where countless family memories were created. And she cried. Not quietly, not politely. She cried like a daughter who finally understood how badly she had hurt her mother. I should have listened. Those were her exact words. I remember reaching across the table and taking her hand. Because unlike everyone else, Emily wasn't trying to defend herself. She wasn't explaining. She wasn't justifying. She was accepting responsibility. And responsibility creates the possibility of forgiveness. Today, our relationship is stronger than ever. Not because nothing happened, because we worked through what happened. Together. And then there was Ethan. The hardest story, the most painful story, the most important story. For months after the meeting, we barely spoke. Not because I hated him, not because I wanted revenge, because some wounds require distance before healing can begin. The hardest truth Ethan had to face wasn't financial, it wasn't legal, it wasn't public embarrassment. The hardest truth was realizing he had become someone he never intended to become. Greed rarely announces itself. It grows quietly. One compromise, one justification, one rationalization at a time, until eventually a person no longer recognizes themselves. That's what happened to Ethan, and facing that reality nearly broke him. Almost, but not quite. About 6 months after the meeting, he appeared at my front door. Alone. No Lauren, no documents, no plans, no presentations. Just my son. Standing there, looking exhausted, older somehow, humbled. He held a small cardboard box. I invited him inside. Neither of us spoke much at first. Finally, he placed the box on the kitchen table. Inside were old photographs, family albums, childhood drawings, letters, memories, things he had spent months collecting. Then he said something I'll never forget. I spent so much time thinking about what you owned that I forgot who you were. The room became very quiet because that sentence contained the entire tragedy, not just his, everyone's. They stopped seeing a mother, started seeing assets, stopped seeing a person, started seeing property, stopped seeing a life, started seeing an inheritance. And when that happens, families lose something precious. Humanity. That afternoon, Ethan apologized, truly apologized. Not for being caught, not for being embarrassed, not for facing consequences. He apologized for forgetting who his mother was, and somehow that mattered a lot. Forgiveness didn't happen immediately, but it began. And sometimes beginnings are enough. Today, Ethan and I speak regularly, carefully, honestly. The trust we once had is still rebuilding, brick by brick, but it is rebuilding, and that's what matters. As for Robert Miller, he became a dear friend, not because he saved me, because he respected me. When everyone else questioned my judgment, Robert asked questions. When everyone else offered assumptions, Robert looked for facts. People like that are rare, very rare. Benjamin Harris remained my attorney. At his recommendation, I updated every document, every authorization, every instruction, every protection. This time, I understood every page I signed, every single one. And David, I still miss him every day. That never changes. Love doesn't disappear simply because someone is gone. But now, when I think about him, I smile more often than I cry. His letter remains in my bedside drawer. Sometimes I reread it, especially one sentence. The sentence that changed everything. This life belongs to you. Those 5 words gave me back something I nearly lost. Myself. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, I looked across the yard one final time. The house stood exactly where it always had. Strong, steady, enduring. Much like the woman living inside it. And for the first time in years, I felt grateful. Not for the betrayal, not for the pain, not for the conflict. I felt grateful because surviving it reminded me of something essential. My worth was never connected to what I owned. It was connected to who I was. And nobody, not family, not money, not fear, could ever take that away from me again.